Taken. Has everyone seen the movie Taken? Very quickly for the uninitiated, right? Taken. The premise is Liam Neeson is this James Bond type figure, works for the CIA. His daughter, just turned 17, wants to travel to Europe for sightseeing, yeah? But Liam Neeson says, oh no, don't do that. If you go to Europe sightseeing, you'll be kidnapped by Muslims and sold into slavery. To which she's like, put a cork in it, Dad, you silly old twat. Europe's all cheese and wine and Schubert. So she goes anyway, and within 5 minutes is kidnapped by Muslims and sold into slavery, which means that Sir Liam has to utilise his very particular set of skills that he has acquired over a very long career, to fly to France and kill everyone, which he does with great efficiency and creativity, but that in a breath is the movie. And the whole point of this movie is to say, look, America, Europe is not what you think it is. It's full of terrible people doing all sorts of terrible things. The authorities are definitely in on it and keep the fuck out, basically. Now, the script for this was written in 2006, okay? That's 3 years before the founding of the English Defence League, and a full 8 years before the Jay inquiry into the Rotherham scandal. And I bet you that if Luc Besson had, via omniscience, written a screenplay that was even darker, that included many of the things we now know, such as all of the victims are children, some of them as young as 11, it is happening in every town and city across the continent, and that the intention is essentially to commit these crimes as an act of war against the native population, he'd have been laughed out of the studio. People would have shouted, nobody's going to buy that, you're a madman. But here we are. Now, I'm going to try and talk about this in a relatively calm fashion. We naturally have a duty as commentators to do our utmost to prevent any Bastille-style response to crimes as filthy and obscene as these, and the basic facts alone are enough to boil the blood of perfectly decent and ordinary people without me fanning the flames through hyperbole. What I won't do, though, is run from the facts. I won't cover them up, or twist them, or pretend they don't exist, because we have a duty to the victims, first and foremost, and to wider society. When discussing the nature of grooming gangs across the country, it's vital, for example, to accurately identify the ideology that creates them. In this particular category of crime, the perpetrators are overwhelmingly Muslim, and Muslim from the most backwards parts of the Islamic world that preach a philosophy you would expect to lead to something like this. We have to be honest about that and not enable this barbaric mentality further through lies and cockamamie propaganda. This doesn't appear to be the policy at LBC, though, unfortunately, and following recent revelations into the crimes in Telford, we had presenter after presenter run for the hills from the 50-foot rapey elephant in the room and broadcast little but their own idiocy. Shall we dive into the swamp? Hold my hand, will you?
Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC.
Child grooming going on over a period of possibly 40 years, it is feared. Child grooming in a Shropshire town, Telford. Up to 1,000 children could have fallen victim. MPs now calling for an inquiry after details emerged about the potential scale of abuse. It was also alleged reports of abuse had been mishandled by the authorities and that 3 murders and 2 deaths could be linked to the scandal. A 16-year-old girl, Lucy Lowe, was killed in 2000 along with her mother and sister after a 26-year-old man who'd got her pregnant at 14 set fire to their house. He did go down for murder, but not sex crimes. Rebecca Watson, who was 13, died in a car crash in 2002, was also being abused. Her friend Vicky Round died following a drugs incident after a grooming gang allegedly got her hooked on crack cocaine when she was 12. And again, there are concerns that authorities now in Telford had a blind eye to justice or whatever because of the ethnicity of the people involved. Let's go to John in Chester. John, you're on the radio. What do you say about this story?
Good morning, Nick.
Good morning.
We're banging on this thing again about it being a race issue. I feel sorry for the Pakistani Christians and Hindus and the Asian Christians and Hindus. These people are linked, mostly, I think it's 99% of them, are Muslim. And
the men, I don't know if it's quite as high as that, but obviously the massive majority, yeah.
It's the vast majority.
Yeah, huge, yeah. But they're not real
causing
Muslims.
it.
But they're not real
Causing
Muslims.
it.
They're not real Muslims. Oh, I guess that's problem solved then, everybody. I thought we had an issue. But it turns out that Sheikh Ferrari has concluded they're not real Muslims. That's a relief. Good night.
But they're not real Muslims.
Why aren't they? Because they rape? Because they rape children? Nick, was the Prophet Muhammad a real Muslim? Because I hate to break it to you, but he consummated his marriage to Aisha when she was 9. The founder of Islam was a pedophile and a rapist. Do you think that might have an effect on the way some Muslims view the issue, or...?
But they're not real Muslims.
Why aren't they? Because they specifically target non-Muslims and treat them as dirt? Keep them as chattel? Nick, the head of the Islamic State, al-Baghdadi, is he a real Muslim? Because his regime sanctions the sexual slavery of non-Muslims and he has a PhD in Islamic Studies from Baghdad University. Remind us, which school do you teach at again?
Again, I didn't study theology, I'm not a theologian.
Are you taking the piss?
Uh-huh. So, let me get this straight. Islamic organizations around the world keep children as sex slaves. The founder of Islam kept children as sex slaves, but these people in Telford, who kept children as sex slaves, they're not real Muslims. Oh, wait a minute, I got it. He must be basing his argument on the scriptures. It's okay, guys. He's about to list the parts of the Quran that prohibit the keeping of children as sex slaves. Yeah, that must be it. Go on, Nick. Sorry, mate.
They're not real. No.
Have you read the Quran?
Not every page of it, no.
I mean, I've got a legal mind. I've read the Quran. My interpretation of it is roughly in a line with what the extremists
But John, I will move on because this is said so much. If we followed the Bible to the letter, we'd be stoning people who have adultery, wouldn't we?
Yeah, so we don't follow the Bible to the letter. I mean, I don't understand this line of logic. Either everybody takes everything in their holy book literally all of the time, or nobody takes anything in their holy book literally any of the time.
In New Testament Leviticus...
Yeah, well, never mind. No, if this conversation, someone could call up and say, you haven't read the Bible, have you? No, I haven't read all of the Bible. Well, you know they stone people who stone adulterers. It's the same.
It's not the same. Christ, Richard, Sam, somebody, explain this to him.
Again, this is one difference with Christianity. These are important differences. One difference is you have this notion that Jesus, his grace supersedes all of that Old Testament law. So that you can have, as a devout Christian who thinks that it's all perfect, you can find a rationale to ignore the Old Testament barbarism because Jesus has delivered his doctrine of grace, right? And then you get the Sermon on the Mount, and you take Jesus and half his moods, and you get very benign, very pacifistic attitudes. Now, Jesus, when he comes back on the Day of Judgment, is going to be wielding a sword and throwing sinners into a lake of fire, and all of that's weird. But in the meantime, you can find, as a Bible-thumping ignoramus who's against science and who's against evolution, who thinks evolution is a hoax, etc., you can still find a basis to just wait around for the rapture, and you do not find a basis for holy war and a desire for martyrdom and all the stuff we're seeing in the Muslim world.
John, it's not the solution is not to say, they're only following the Quran. They are not. They are not, because the people who do follow the Quran just use it as a guide. They do not use it as an excuse to rape and murder 12-year-olds.
I know they use it as a guide. A guide to what, exactly? Oh yeah, you haven't fucking read it, so you don't fucking know, so fucking zip it, you cunt. Could you be any more naive than this? He sees religion as this totally benign, irrelevant detail, like a hobby or something. Yeah, you know, some people like Islam, some like Christianity. I prefer racquetball myself, but it's all the same, man. Nick, your position is laughable. Religions are different. Religious communities are different in terms of the fervency of their belief, and specific ideas have specific consequences. Pick up any book by a new atheist and unfuck yourself, please, because there comes a point, and I think that with the mass rape of our own children, we've reached that now. When your ignorance stops being funny, you are part of the problem. Seriously. And yet, it gets worse. Now, my stomach isn't really big enough to contain all of the vomit necessary for responding in full to James O'Brien on topics of importance. The man is a joke. He is a pig-headed narcissist. But he does have an audience, so I guess that warrants a rebuttal of some kind. This just beggars belief. Prepare to be profoundly irritated.
Let's begin with a few home truths. This, of all subjects in the current climate in Britain, is almost impossible to discuss without offending pretty much everybody. If I don't make reference, for example, to the fact that these men are almost always of Pakistani extraction and therefore, on paper at least, Muslims, then the not just sort of mad far-right knuckle-draggers, but also some perfectly decent people.
The far-right gets a mention immediately. Immediate. First 10 seconds. Fuck the far-right, just slip that in there. I mean, we can't possibly have a conversation about Muslim violence without discussing them. We have to talk about the far-right. And let's insult the far-right. He hasn't insulted the rapists yet. But yeah, fuck those knuckle-draggers. EDL, boo. Pegida, boo. Never mind that they got the whole thing right. The whole thing right. Tommy Robinson was protesting Muslim rape gangs back in 2009, before anybody even knew it was a thing. You should be thanking him, you sanctimonious prick.
Clearly there's a problem. Clearly the English Defence League is a phenomenon that swept this country. And with the issues I'm talking about, Jeremy, if I ask you, do you know anyone that's hooked on heroin sold to them by Muslim gangs? You probably don't. I do. Do you know any beautiful girls that you went to school with that are now wearing a burqa that don't see their family? Probably don't. I do. Do you know anyone who's been murdered by a Muslim gang? You probably don't. I do. Do you know any 15-year-old girls that you know that you've grown up with that have been raped or pimped? You don't. So I don't expect you to understand the issues.
These are all personal issues of yours.
Personal issues in towns and cities like mine that are happening, and they're not happening with the Sikh community. They're not happening with the Jewish community.
And indeed, they're not happening with most Muslims.
No, they're happening within the Islamic community. This is what I'm saying, that it's an Islamic problem. And when I'm just a simple person, so I'm just a normal person, but when I'm looking at, I have to look for where this hatred's coming from.
Not just sort of mad far-right knuckle-draggers, but also some perfectly decent people who worry enormously about elements of these reports that talk about the reports not being properly pursued and the investigations not being properly undertaken for fear of a perception of racism. So if you try to report these stories without reference to race or culture, people, I think, understandably kick off on a grand scale. Problem is, if I say Asian grooming gang, I get loads of complaints from Asians who aren't Muslims. If I say Muslim grooming gang, I get loads of complaints from Muslims who aren't members of grooming gangs. I mean, how often do we reference the religion of an offender when reporting crimes?
When it's relevant to the crime, when it can inform you as to a possible motive behind the crime, when the victims of the crime reference it. As a teenager, I was taken to various houses and flats above takeaways in the north of England to be beaten, tortured and raped over 100 times. I was called a white slag and white cunt as they beat me. They made it clear that because I was a non-Muslim and not a virgin, and because I didn't dress modestly, that they believed I deserved to be punished. When the perpetrators of the crime reference it, white girls and non-Muslim girls are bad because you dress like slags. You show the curves of your bodies. Showing the gap between your thighs means you're asking for it, and therefore you're immoral. White girls sleep with hundreds of men. You are the other girls. You are worthless, and you deserve to be gang raped. And when Muslim community leaders reference it as an explanation. The view of some Islamic preachers towards white women can be appalling. They encourage their followers to believe that these women are habitually promiscuous, decadent and sleazy, sins which are made all the worse by the fact that they are kafirs and non-believers. Their dress code, from miniskirts to sleeveless tops, is deemed to reflect their impure and immoral outlook. According to this mentality, these white women deserve to be punished for their behaviour by being exploited and degraded.
But of course, there is a fat constituency in this country. Nick had one or two on with him earlier who use stories like this as a really desperate and profoundly ugly attempt to sort of argue that the contents of the Quran somehow create rapists and paedophiles, as if there's a book in the world that you could read that would turn you into someone that was capable or prepared to coerce a 14-year-old girl into sex and...
Sorry, let me stop you there. So, just to be clear, the concept of people getting ideas from books is new to you, is it? You find that ridiculous? Well, by the way, it should go without saying that in most cases it's not just the Quran, it's also the Hadith, it's the example set by the Prophet, it's the history of Islam, and it's the religious leaders in the mosques hammering home medieval messages again and again, week after week. All of this falls under the banner of Islam. But if you're looking for the pure case, so to speak, we do have documented instances of people like Adam Gaddan and John Walker Lind, Americans who grew up in non-Muslim backgrounds, discovered Islam through the scriptures, and then ran off to become terrorists. And if books can get people to massacre civilians, what can't they get people to do?
You have that constituency. You have to be conscious of their existence because they're foul, but they're not as foul as the men that undertake this sort of behaviour.
Did you get that, everybody? Sam, Ayan, Douglas, Majid, Christopher, Richard, Lawrence, Tariq, Daniel, Bill, Urshad, Dave, Gad, Raheel, Stephen, Salman. You're all foul. Why? Because you acknowledge that religions are composed of ideas and those ideas have consequences. Just thought you should know. Don't worry though, you're not as bad as rapists and murderers. You can be described in the same sentence, using the same adjective, but James does acknowledge that you aren't quite as awful. Congratulations!
I don't think that they're Muslims in any meaningful sense of the word. I don't think they'd know one end of the Quran from the other. The idea that they're somehow spiritual or observant when they are routinely employing tactics to enslave these girls that are expressly forbidden, drugs, alcohol, all of the above.
And I love this argument as well. They're not real Muslims because they gave them alcohol. As if not following one Sharia prescription means they don't believe in any of it. It's like arguing that creationists in the Bible Belt, right? They eat shellfish. And Leviticus tells them they can't do that, okay? So I guess that means their creationism has nothing to do with Christianity. Case closed. It's just so sad and desperate. And I just want you to know, James, you can't actually hide from the truth here. I know you think you can, but please understand, when I listen to you talk about issues like this, it's like I'm watching somebody about to have an accident. Do you know what I mean? I'm like a spectator at a sporting event, and I can see that the little retarded fella in the back there is about to come off his bike. And that might be fine, but the problem is, he's going to take the whole fucking troop with him. And what do we have here, folks? Oh, it's James O'Brien of LBC, look. Sniffing his balls there. Happy as a clown. Ignorance is bliss, eh, James? Oh, what's that? And there comes reality, look, picking up speed. Quick, do something, James, do something! And Western civilization is fucked. Nice work, James. You regressive shit stain.
It is, however, the only label we've got at the moment. You start talking about regions of Pakistan, you start talking about Mirpur, Bangladesh, areas where poverty and misogyny are so deeply entrenched that it's going to be a generation or three before anyone can move out of it. You can do that, but it overcomplicates the issue. I apologise to the massive majority of Muslims who have no more to do with this sort of behaviour than I do, but predominantly Muslim is the phrase I always go with on these occasions, even though the knuckle-dragging members of the far right, who I referenced a moment ago, somehow managed to miss that on an almost industrial scale.
Yes, thank you. You hate the far right, we all understand. But that does beg the question. Why do you always go with it? Why do you describe them as Muslims? I mean, you don't think that Islam has anything to do with the crime? So yeah, I am a bit confused as to why you'd use that label. Why don't you say Pakistani? Or Asian? After all, you think them being Muslim is incidental. It's like them all having the same favourite movie, The Bourne Identity or something. Up to 1,000 girls in Telford abused by hardcore Matt Damon fans. The newspapers might as well say that, right, from your perspective. I mean, I know why I call them Muslim. It's because I think the label's actually informative. I think that making the Islamic connection helps explain aspects of the crime. And I'm right, by the way. You're totally fucking retarded. You know nothing about Islam, nothing about Muslims, nothing about the psychology of religion. And if locking people up for being offensive is in vogue nowadays, the last 10 minutes of pig shit coming out of your face warrants the guillotine, probably.
First off, the Quran speaks of those whom your right hand possesses. That's the sword hand, and it refers to women that you've captured. So sex slaves are referred to in the Quran itself. But the most detail we have about sex slavery comes from the Sunnah, S-U-N-N-A, the Sunnah of Muhammad. And the most famous sex slave that Muhammad had was a Christian woman. Her name was Mary. She was Coptic Christian. She was fair of complexion and had wavy dark hair. She was one of his favorite sexual partners, and she gave him a son named Ibrahim. So remember now, the words and actions of Muhammad, over 91 verses in the Quran say, every Muslim is to imitate Muhammad's actions and words. So if Muhammad had sex slaves, all of his companions had sex slaves. As a matter of fact, he gave sex slaves away to his jihadi lieutenants as rewards for them. So no, sex slaves are part of the Sunnah of Muhammad. Yes, the Sunnah of Muhammad, and this is what Islamic State is saying. Look, Muhammad had sex slaves. We have sex slaves. Life is good.
I've got one more for you. Now, Nick was bad. James, terrible. And fuck you, James, while we're here. And I say that from the bottom of my heart. But we are about to enter the third circle of regressive hell with Sheila Fogarty. This, by any standard, is probably one of the worst conversations on any subject ever. It just so happens to be on one of extreme importance. So brace yourselves.
Jeff has called from Edmonton. Hello.
Hello there. Yes, thanks for covering this, Sheila, because there's been a media blackout when it comes to the BBC on this matter.
No, there hasn't, but anyway.
Well,
there hasn't.
It's a matter of opinion.
It's not. It's a matter of fact, Jeff.
Well, there's no coverage of this on the BBC.
There is.
There isn't, I'm afraid.
Well, there is. But anyway, we're LBC.
Not a great start, is it? There was coverage on the BBC at the time of this call-in show, which was the 16th of March, I think. But what Jeff is referring to, I believe, is the first 24 hours after the story broke. Here is what the England page of the BBC looked like on the morning of the 12th, when the Mail, the Mirror, everybody else was already talking about it. I don't see the word Telford there. Do any of you? We've got Ken Dodd, just passed away, very sad. Or as Ken would say, rambunctious. What else we got? 2 Labour MPs fighting over who gets to give Jeremy Corbyn a reach around. No one gives a fuck about that. Oh, there is a story about Jamie Carragher spitting on a 14-year-old girl, which I suppose some people might classify as more important than the raping of 1,000 14-year-old girls. But anyway, it's nice to see the state broadcaster doing its duty by the state, eh?
Let's go into this a bit further. Now, the Muslims do know about this problem within the Pakistani community. And, you know, obviously they are concerned about it as well as everybody else. And
within, all right, Jeff, I'm not apologising. People, when I just bring a bit of reason to bear on this, people say I'm apologising for rapists. Clearly, I would never apologise for a rapist.
Okay, I'm getting scared now. Anytime somebody says, I'm not apologising for rapists, but that's when I start to worry.
You never talk about the white problem of abuse that we have in this country.
I have an excellent idea. Let's change the subject.
Shall we talk about it then?
Well, there is one, just so you know. It's just that we don't call it the white problem. So don't call it the Muslim problem, because it isn't. Nor is it the Pakistani problem, because there are plenty of law-abiding, decent Pakistani men and women in this country. It so happens that these grooming gangs...
Oh, Christ almighty. How much of the regressive agenda can one person squeeze into a soundbite? Let's take a look. Fuck white people? Yep, that was definitely in there. Defend the Muslims? Yep, it's not a Muslim problem, she said. Mention that it's not all? Check. Number 9, if someone presents a problem to you, pivot to talking about a non-problem. Yeah, Pakistanis make terrific kebabs, don't you know? If someone presents a problem to you, mention another problem. Yes, white people rape too. We can't forget that. And virtue signal wherever possible. I make that 6 in as many seconds. Your homework for the week is to beat that. Good luck. She's like a rabid skunk. And Jess just stepped on her tail and now she's spraying shit all over the airwaves as some sort of defense mechanism. Good afternoon, Sheila. I'd like to talk to you about the problem of Muslim grooming gangs and how we can work with the community to solve the problem and build, in general, a more cohesive, collaborative and integrated society. What do you think about it? Oh, thanks very much.
It so happens that these grooming gangs are mainly Asian, and that can't be ignored. But still, most abuse of children in this country takes place in the home or the friendship group of the family, and most of it is done by white men. So if you want to bring it down to race, we'll do it. But if we could just focus on how we protect children, I think it would be much more of a comfortable ride.
Jeff hasn't actually mentioned race yet, but you obviously think Islam is a race, which, as Richard Dawkins once put it, makes you a racist. Think about it. But wow, most paedophiles in the UK are white men. What a stellar point. That's a QED right there. You know what else is mostly white, Sheila? The police officers that catch the pedophiles. As are the lawyers who prosecute them, and the judges who sentence them. 85% of the country is white. Most of everything is done by white people. Not this though. Not grooming gangs. Oh no. 84% of all gang members convicted since 2005 have been Muslim. Now, can we talk about that? Is that a problem, Sheila? Does it matter that about 3% of the population are responsible for 84% of the crime in this category? Once again, ignoring it doesn't solve it. You just look ridiculous.
We protect children by letting the police be able to do their job without fear of being reprimanded by,
We do. I agree. There was a problem with how this was approached because of race, definitely.
There's a real problem with coming in from the EU, and this has happened all across Europe, is that all the sort of governments that are working with a cultural Marxist elements. And what this does is, not only does it divide everybody up into little groups where, like you say, you can't just blame everyone for but we are unable to attain what's going on. I mean, let me just tell you a statistic. In Sweden, do you know that now that 1 in 4 women in Sweden will be raped in their lifetime?
I don't know that.
Daniel Greenfield, Daniel Greenfield has been quoted.
Why don't you know that? You're a journalist. You're supposed to care about these issues, at least you pretend to. And I think Jeff is quite right to bring up Sweden and the rest of Europe. We aren't the only ones suffering with this. Third world Islamic attitudes to women are making all of our countries more savage and dangerous. There are Muslims across the continent who believe that they are entitled to treat women however they please. Some who feel that Western women need to be punished for their immodesty. Hell, there are even some who believe they have a responsibility to engage in some sort of rape jihad to destroy the local population and spread Islam through demographic warfare.
إنها أوروبا التي شاخت وهرمت وتريد طاقة بشرية ولا أقوى من طاقتنا البشرية. نحن المسلمين كذلك أوروبا كل أقطارها كلهم تقطر قلوبهم حقدا على المسلمين يتمنون لنا الموت ولكنهم فقدوا إخصابهم ويبحثون عن إخصاب عندنا. سنخصبهم وسوف ننزل وسوف ننجب منهم لأننا سوف نفتح بلادهم.
I mean, Jesus, who the fuck does he sound like?
The trouble with Scotland is that it's full of Scots. Grant them prima nocte. First night, when any common girl inhabiting their lands is married, our nobles shall have sexual rights to her on the night of her wedding. If we can't get them out, we'll breed them out.
Despite being a fiction in the context of 12th century England, this is how a small minority of Muslims view their role in our societies.
Is it?
Afraid so.
This is the difference. You've always had paedophiles in this country, and they operate usually on their own. But now you're finding this is the difference between these other grooming gangs, these Pakistani grooming gangs.
They don't operate usually on their own. There's no evidence for that either. There's all kinds of evidence of paedophile rings in lots of countries, in Europe and everywhere else in the world, Jeff. You are trying to suggest that people with darker skin are more likely to be rapists, and there is no evidence for that whatsoever. And I think we protect our children best if we, A, have the facts and then give them the facts. Passing on our own prejudice won't protect anybody.
Well, there we have it, gang. Facts are racist. What an abortion of thought and communication. She does a segment designed to focus on the issues in Telford, the facts around which are not controversial. This town is part of a nationwide scandal following the activities of grooming gangs where 84% of the participants are Muslim, 100% of the victims are non-Muslim, and she uses her platform to hurl smoke bombs across the airwaves to distract you, to change the subject, to attempt to remove the problem with words. And all three of them today have been guilty of this to some extent, and what I found interesting was that they actually hail from different areas of the political spectrum. Look, we have a conservative, a socialist, and a whatever the hell that is. I think she's meant to be centre-left or something. She worked at the BBC for quite some time, so that would make sense. All three of them white, British, middle-aged, powerful, and clueless. Is anybody in any doubt about the need for a complete uprooting of the establishment at this point? This is why the alt media is flourishing. This is why alternative politics is flourishing. And it's why it will continue to do so for as long as these people keep their heads in the sand.
So with your background, Majid, what do you think is the cause of this then? Can I reverse the question to you?
Yeah, I think there is a cultural, religious, patriarchal attitude within these communities that has been kept under the lid for so long because people have been scared to talk about integration, and this is what the 2016 Casey Review looked into, and the failure of this country to integrate people that have come from British South Asian backgrounds who are Muslim, and of course after that Somalis who then came, Afghans, and that's what's caused it here. You've got those attitudes that are related to religious and cultural and patriarchal approaches that are traditional within those communities. Of course, Islamism as an ideology reinforces it, but even those who are not Islamist, many of these cases, these people weren't religious, but there is a cultural approach even within traditional fundamentalist Islam, devoid of its political cousin, the Islamist ideology, that simply, just in simple language, on a religious level, that needs to be challenged. You know, at the end of the day, you've got that with all traditional religions, that women are seen as a certain second-tier gender, but of course, the rest of the world is catching up to this stuff, what with, women's empowerment causes, as well as gay marriage equality. Within Muslim communities, as we know, there's still a long way to go when it comes to these sorts of conversations.